All right, everyone. So we did a video the other day on Death by Lightning. What a fantastic, fantastic series. You can watch it on Netflix now. If you haven't seen it yet, click out of this video, go watch it, and then come back to this video. I don't want any spoilers if you haven't seen it yet, but we're going to talk about the historical accuracy of this. Now, this is from a USA Today article that's citing, I believe, the director. Let's just double check here. The creator right here. Okay, so that's who's talking about this, right? Because I was wondering, should we really do a deep dive into how accurate each thing is? And I thought, well, the problem is that there's probably differing opinions on so many different topics within it that it's probably at the end of the day wouldn't do much good even to fact check it on our own. Instead, let's actually hear from the creator, right? I think that would be a much better way of seeing, how it was put together. So this is from USA Today. Assassins lying in wait, political corruption, drunken vice presidential nominees. Is Netflix Death by Lightning a wild invention of Hollywood, or was a 19th century political history actually this crazy? The answer is yes, says Mike Makowski, creator of the historical Netflix drama now streaming about the assassination of President James Garfield, Michael Shannon, in 1881. These situations are insane and so unfathomable by today's standards and how we understand our politics. The superb limited series, which also stars Matthew McFadden as assassin Charles Guiteau and Nick Offerman as Garfield's vice president, Chester A. Arthur, is based on historical Candace Millard's 2011 book, Destiny of the Republic. Okay, so this is based off the book. That's interesting to know. Did not know that. The book and the series both bring to light a period from American history not often mentioned or emphasized in our textbooks or modern culture, but is a fascinating and oftentimes absurd story nonetheless, and Mikowski and his fellow writers did not need to add much to make it worthy of 4 episodes of exciting and shocking television. So before we continue, I want to stop there for 1 second because this to me makes a really, really strong argument for, the bottom line is if you go on Netflix, if you go on any of these, streaming services and you look for documentaries, you see the same documentaries or you see documentaries on the same topics, right? The biggest moments in American history or in world history, you have documentary after documentary after documentary after documentary on it. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? I've watched a million on all these topics, but there is so many other events throughout history that just don't get, I think, their full, their full storytelling. And if you're someone who's directing these things, right? If you're someone who's like, I want to make a docu series like this, go out and find some of these moments. This was a really, after watching this, I think anybody that watches it agrees, this was a gold mine, right? This was such a fascinating story that stayed pretty close to the truth throughout. And it was so awesome to watch. And yet, as pointed out in this article, it doesn't get talked about much. How often is this talked about? How many schools across the country, right, are teaching about this more than just a passing discussion? Oh, this was one of the presidents that got assassinated, right? How how deep do they go into all of this? And I just think at the end of the day, there is so much more here. USA Today spoke with Mikowski about what's real and what's not in the series. His main goal, he said, was to get viewers more interested in American history, even if the show couldn't tell the entire story. I definitely was not able to include everything in 4 hours, he said. The hope is that people are able to engage with history in that way and that they're curious to learn more. After watching the series, you likely had the same questions we did. Just gonna point this out, had the intended effect. Had that intended effect, meaning that's exactly how I felt about it after watching it. It's like, wow. I mean, what other points of American history do we not talk about enough? The only thing I would push back on is why did it have to be squished? I mean, it was it was 4 episodes. Why couldn't it have been 6 episodes? Why couldn't it have been 7 episodes? That's one of the beauties of these streaming services is you could produce a lot more, right? Than so you can't have a 10-hour movie right in theaters. You can have a lot of episodes and people will binge them. So that to me would be my only pushback there is okay, you couldn't get everything in there. Well, why not? Going forward, put everything in there. This had the appeal. Like after it was over, it wasn't a situation where I was, you know, like, oh man, that was too quick. But it also didn't feel like, oh man, that thank God that's over. There was a lot of, I think, room they could have added more to it. I think it's fine the way they did it, but you could have probably told the whole story, right? And you could have done a bunch of other things. Was James Garfield really that much of a stand up guy? Did he have his own indiscretions and affairs? Although the show merely alludes to problems in the past and Garfield's marriage to Lucidera Garfield, Betty Gilpin, there is historical evidence to suggest he had a relationship with Kate Sprague, the paramour of Garfield's political rival Roscoe Conkling, Shea Wickham. Sprague is played by Tupence Middleton. At a minimum, she and Garfield at one point, when Garfield was more rooted in the Washington scene, the two of them enjoyed a very close friendship, Bukowski said. He added that the show decided not to include that because it was so far in Garfield's past, and they didn't want to bog down the show with flashbacks. However, Garfield does say to his wife in the show, "You of all people know that, or the one person who essentially knows that I'm the furthest thing from a great man." So, I don't know if that had to be added in necessarily. I do think that wasn't, I remember that quote. I didn't maybe pull as much of that out of it, right? That much meaning to it, but this is very interesting. And I do think if I had to put one piece of, if I had to say one thing that was negative about this show, which I feel like I'm kind of grasping at straws to find any negatives, but if I had to put one, I do think it actually may have been even a better series had they actually went into some of the failings of Garfield on his own, right? Some of his, instead of just having this little thing, right? Have the because in this thing, he's somebody who throughout the whole thing basically does no wrong, right? I mean, there's very little. Maybe there's small parts here and there you could say, oh, that's wrong, but there's very little that he does wrong. And once again, this is being way overly critical, just going off of what he talked about here. But I do think the show may have even benefited from that. One of the things I love about I'm forgetting the exact title of it, but it's the one that's similar to this about Abraham Lincoln. Is they show kind of the process of how Abraham Lincoln does what he does, right? To me, the kind of behind the scenes stuff to show his struggles with different things doesn't take away from the story. It makes it even better, right? Lincoln overcoming all of that, right? Everything that he had to face and to do what he did, right, and to save the United States. It only makes the story more intriguing, right? It only makes you appreciate what Lincoln did more, right? This wasn't something. Whereas when we look back now, it's like, oh yeah, we know what happened, right? We already know the ending to the war, but to see how the things he was up against, right, what he was facing in those moments, and to see it the way you do in that show, I think only adds to it, right? It only makes it better. Just like in this, when you see what Garfield's up against, it only makes what he did better, right? It only gives you more kind of it makes you feel better about it, right? It makes you feel like, wow, this guy just did something amazing, right? And so I actually think this would have been something worth including just because it takes away from, and I think you see it in some of the responses to this of, wow, man, Garfield, he was just perfect. It's easy to get that feeling when you just watch this, right? Could people really just freely walk up to the senators and presidents in the 1880s? Could Charles Guiteau really accost those people in public and private spaces? Presidents didn't have security detail in the 19th century, says Makowski. Presidents at that time would have office hours essentially every day in the White House. Anybody could show up and have an audience with the president, just a little nuts. That was crazy, to see that how he was walking around, talking to all of the big players, right, in Washington was absolutely shocking. Absolutely shocking. It was incomprehensible to men of Garfield's era that anyone could ever want to go out and shoot a president, even though, of course, 15 years prior, President Abraham Lincoln had been killed, but he was killed days after the Civil War, and it was a very, very, very politically charged moment. Garfield just saw himself as a civil servant. He wasn't flashy, Makowski adds. In fact, the show takes its title from a direct Garfield quote about the unlikelihood of political assassination. Assassination could be no more guarded against than death by lightning. Garfield believed he couldn't be protected from random political violence by a security detail or anything else. What about the Secret Service? The Secret Service didn't have responsibility for the full time protection of the president until 1902, after the 1901 assassination of President William McKinley. This is pretty nuts that you have this kind of run of assassinations, and still, it doesn't, nothing changes until after this. Pretty nuts. Was Guiteau's brain really kept by the government? Yes, and they cut out his brain out of his head as a medical specimen. Mikowski says, I don't think that doctors in the time were equipped to look through a brain and understand the person, so they sort of just saved it for the future and then forgot about it for a number of years. Historians argue that Guiteau was likely mentally ill, but no official diagnosis has drawn consensus. But as part of his research for the show, Mikowski got a chance to see the brain in person. I got to see the brain, he says. I had to actually get special government permission because it's at, bizarrely enough, a military base in Maryland. The government doesn't like to, as a rule, like showcase of assassin artifacts. This is wild, absolutely crazy, and I wonder if they'll ever actually look at the brain, right, with modern technology. Did Guiteau and Chester A. Arthur really have a drunken night out at a ladies' boxing match? No, Makowski admits that this is wholly the invention of himself and writers, but when you have Matthew McFadden and Nick Offerman, I just couldn't resist. Arthur had a passing film familiarity with Guiteau. He says Guiteau was around a lot. He would show up at the campaign headquarters. He was constantly trying to impose himself on political figures, but there's no real evidence to suggest that the two of them spent the night out. One thing I think about this is if I had to, it's not that I'm trying to think of negatives, but just to maybe play devil's advocate a little bit, is I do think that, the truth of the matter is when you look at Guteau, right? And even they said above, like historians kind of think this guy was mentally ill, right? But at least how he's portrayed in the show, right? And so I'm not talking off any historical fact, just how he's portrayed in the show. They did such a great job of showing how much of a scumbag this dude was, right? Like, look, you just saw it in the little things that he did, stealing money from his sister, right? Dining and dashing at that one place, taking money, right? He takes the little notebooks from the White House. This is just a guy who has no problem, right? Has no problem screwing over everybody. He's pretending that he's some big fighter for the poor, and he's just latching on to a movement, and it's all about glory for himself. You can see that in every step of the way here. That everything he does was about trying to climb the social ladder, right? The issue, and I guess even in this, he's doing his best, right, to get up there. But it's all about himself. It has nothing to do with the country, right? Even after he, kills Garfield, right? He's still, kind of in his own world, all about himself and about my book, right? My book is gonna sell, and he's taking pictures, and he's talking about how he's playing the book, the publishers off each other. He's just a disgusting, disgusting human being, and I did think that some of the moments with Arthur, I don't want to say it did a disservice to the film as a whole, but I think it put a little bit too much importance on Guteau, right? Because if you were watching this, Chester Arthur, while he's drunk, is telling him, "Oh yeah, we'll let you speak at the convention," and you know all of this, and Chester Arthur doesn't even remember him. So I definitely think you could have showcased Chester Arthur doing his own thing and not had Guteau, so buddy buddy with him if that was a historically accurate. I don't. Maybe they did it because they're like, look, we want to cut the time down, so we're going to showcase both. But you know, the truth is, and once again, just going off of this series, is Guteau is a scumbag. I mean, in every way, shape, or form. And then of course he does this disgusting act. Um, which makes him pure evil right by the end of this thing. But he is a disgusting, disgusting person. And I do think in those moments, right, with Chester Arthur, you're taking away a little bit from that. You're not quite showcasing. You're making it seem like Chester Arthur is promising him something. When the truth is, from what I understand, and put in the comments if I'm wrong on this, if you've studied this more, but from my understanding, Guto never had any sort of like, he was showing up, but there was never any kind of promise of him doing anything. Okay. Was Garfield really killed by an infection caused by his doctors? Now, before I read this, I knew going in that this was the one thing I did know was true. There was another thing I watched on this. I don't remember what the name of it was. I should probably try to find it on this same. So I knew that this was the case. I knew that the infection was what killed him. Yes, but that bit of historical trivia is part of Garfield's abbreviated legacy. The show portrays Garfield's doctors rummaging around in his open wound and using a metal detector in a desperate search to remove the bullet. After a prolonged convalescence, we see him die of an infection besides his wife, Greedy Betty Gilpin. Garfield was shot before germ theory was widely accepted by doctors who did not wash their hands or sanitize medical tools. Whether it came directly from his doctor's dirty hands and equipment is hard to prove with 100% certainty, as the entire world was dirty back then, too. According to a PBS article about the assassination, this assault and its aftercare probably led to an overwhelming infection known as sepsis. The doctor's dirty hands and fingers are often blamed as the vehicle that imported the infection into the body. But given that Garfield was a surgical and gunshot wound patient in the germ ridden, dirty, gilded age, a period when many doctors still laughed at germ theory, there might have been many other sources of infection as well. The one thing, and once again, I haven't looked into this fully, but I do know that I'm pretty sure there was a lot of stuff in the press about this after the fact. So I do think that um, the blaming the doctor was not something of like, well, now we have technology and so we know germ theory is real and that's why there's criticism. I'm pretty sure that there was kind of this like he did something that was not just bad because we can now look back on it and judge it, but even bad for its time. Um, and they kind of make the point in the actual show of actually if nothing had been done, he would have been fine, right? And I do think, from my understanding, that's actually true, right? If there had been basically nothing done and he just covered, that it might have been fine. So I wanted to do this because I found what Mikowski has to say here pretty darn interesting. This is one of those shows that I hope spawns a lot more of them because this is the best way I think to, I don't mind documentaries. I love documentaries when they're done right, but these feel like they give you even more. Like my dream scenario is you produce a good documentary in a documentary style, and then you compare it with one of these docu series because like I just think it comes to another level when you watch these of really understanding the characters, right? In a documentary, you're getting a lot of facts. You're just getting here's a fact, here's a fact. You're not getting the theme. And that's what one of the things we talked about in our initial video on Death by Lightning is it's not that it's okay to not have the correct facts because it's not, right? You should have, right? The story you're telling needs to be true, but it's much more important in something like Death by Lightning to have what is going on be like how can you say it, like directionally true, right? Like you want to be giving off the right idea more than just incidental facts, right? So for instance, with Garfield being actually no, that's not a good example of it. Let's think of one of these from um well, actually, this is a good one, right? Kind of the Charles Guteau, kind of accosting them everywhere they are, right? There were obviously the conversations that were had were not technically the case, right? Not everything that he did and said that they showed in the docuseries is true, right? They clearly made up some of the conversations, but it's giving off the theme that's the real theme, right? So we don't know exactly what was said in every conversation, but that's what it was like. So I think that's more important, not more important than getting the big facts true, right? Like you can't have major things that are wrong, right? How he dies, that has to be the real way, right? It can't be like, well, we're going to kind of make up that way, or the moment when he gets the nomination, right? That kind of stuff you have to be factual on, but all of the other things you should be working to give off the right theme. That I think they nail in this, and I do like how they're able to do it at the end to give you kind of not a fact check, but like an overarching, these are the big takeaways, these are the big facts about everything that happened after that we haven't showed you. So I hope this spawns a lot of more of these on different topics. Look, there's so many big historical events that I could watch documentary after documentary after documentary on, but sometimes it's awesome to learn about these other parts of history, right? And just let's just be honest, after watching this, do you feel like this was probably a pretty important part of history? Because I do, right? There was a major transformation in just 3 months of his administration, and then with Arthur taking the presidency, there was more, right? There was that the change that was started in the first 3 months continued. So absolutely, just a fantastic, fantastic, fantastic show, and I hope we get more of them. So thank you all for watching.